My dad works in B2B marketing. He came by my school for career day and said he was a big ROAS man. Then he told everyone how much he loved calculating his return on ad spend. My friends still laugh at me to this day.
Not everyone gets B2B, but with LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people who do. Get a $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/results to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be, to be.
Good night, itchy eyes. Good night, sudden sneeze. Good night to your symptoms of allergies. Zysol is the allergy medicine you take before bed. It provides powerful relief while you rest your head. Not just all night, but all the next day. Zysol keeps working, keeping allergies at bay. And without those annoying symptoms disturbing your rest, you can wake up the next morning feeling your absolute best. Remember, be wise all, take Zysol. At night.
This is Addiction Medicine Journal Club. I'm Dr. Sonya Tredici.
And I'm Dr. John Keenan.
We believe that addiction is a disease that can be treated, and we want to help you stay up to date with the latest research that you can use in your addiction medicine practice. Don't forget that this podcast offers Category 1 CME through MyCares and Michigan State University. The links for the CME will be in the show notes. For this episode, we're going to be discussing 4 more articles that changed our practice in this past year. If you want to hear the first 4 articles that we profiled, you can listen to the previous episode, which came out about 2 weeks ago. So, John, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. I'm a little low energy at the moment, but I'm excited to hit these last 4 articles.
Well, I don't understand how you have energy at all after seeing like 97 patients in the office or whatever you did today.
30.
So many patients. Internal medicine, we got nothing compared to family medicine. I think I saw like 6 patients.
Well, you guys checked that succussion splash and stuff, right?
Totally. I
Long drawn out physical exam, succussion splash.
Yeah. I strive to identify subclinical splenomegaly. Okay, wait. Before we start, anyone who's an internist will sort of feel this. I had an attending who will remain nameless in residency, and after night float, so I've just worked a 12-hour overnight shift at our busy hospital. I'm night float rounding with the attending where he's going over our complex cases, and I was criticized in front of the group for not identifying subclinical splenomegaly on my physical exam of like one of my like 12 admissions overnight, and I still haven't gotten over that.
Yeah, war stories from residency, right?
Oh my God. All right. Well, hey, why don't you kick it off? Let's, or actually, I'm going to kick it off. I'm going to kick it off with this article.
You go, Sonya.
I'll go. All right. And just to remind everyone, these are real patients and real cases of ours, and this is really what we thought. And so we really hope you'll write in and tell us what you think about these articles. So this patient is a 55-year-old woman. She has opioid use disorder, depression, chronic hepatitis C, hypertension, and tobacco use disorder, smoking 1 to 2 packs per day. After many years of maybe helpful suggestions from her PCP, which is me, she decides to try and quit smoking. She wants to avoid psychoactive medications, so she's not interested in varenicline, and she wants to use nicotine replacement. She tries a 21 milligram nicotine patch, and she uses these little nicotine pouches for breakthrough. She comes back and says that it didn't work at the follow-up, and so she stopped using the patches and she continues to smoke. So what I used to say was, I'm sorry the patches didn't work. Let's give it another try. You want the same prescription for nicotine patches again? But then I read this article, Smoking Cessation After Initial Treatment Failure with Varenicline or Nicotine Replacement, a randomized clinical trial. And this study was really cool because it's one of the few to address how to help people after a failed quit attempt. And for those of you in clinical practice, you know that failed quit attempts are the norm, but there's actually not a lot of data on what to do in that situation. The clinical question in this study is, what is the best subsequent strategy after a failed quit attempt with varenicline or combined nicotine replacement therapy? It was a double-blind, placebo-controlled, sequential, randomized trial, got all the adjectives, where people were randomized to receive 6 weeks of varenicline or nicotine. And the nicotine was patches plus PRN nicotine lozenges. After 6 weeks, non-abstainers, so people who had not quit, were re-randomized to continue the treatment to switch to the other treatment. So if you were on varenicline, you went to nicotine. If you were on nicotine, you went to varenicline, or to increase the medication dose for 6 additional weeks. So you could go to 42 milligrams of nicotine a day or 3 milligrams of varenicline a day. The population was 490 people from a Texas tobacco treatment clinic. So keep in mind, these are people who are very motivated to quit because they're actually going to a tobacco treatment clinic. They smoked on average 1 pack a day for a mean of 28 years. The outcomes were self-reported and carbon monoxide confirmed 7-day abstinence at 12 weeks. That was the primary outcome. And the secondary outcome was continuous abstinence for 30 days and continuous tobacco abstinence for 6 months. So I put this in like a flow chart for our lecture that we're doing for Pennsylvania Society of Addiction Medicine. And you can't see that, of course, on the podcast. But just to try to summarize some of the results. So initially, people were randomized to get varenicline and placebo nicotine, or nicotine and placebo varenicline. And then after 6 weeks, they saw who had quit smoking. So people in the varenicline group, 72% had quit smoking at 6 weeks. In the nicotine group, 78% had quit smoking at 6 weeks. So these are great numbers. The people who didn't quit smoking then got re-randomized, and you either got your same treatment again, you got switched to the other treatment, or you got a higher dose of the treatment you were on. So if you were on nicotine, you got higher dose nicotine. If you were on varenicline, you got high dose varenicline. And the results then, they looked at 12 weeks. So of the people who were re-randomized, because they didn't quit the first time, to receive 3 milligrams of varenicline a day, 20% of those people were able to quit. Of the people who were on nicotine and then re-randomized to receive 42 milligrams of nicotine a day, so 2 patches, 14% of them had quit. Of the patients who were started on nicotine and then re-randomized to normal varenicline, 2 milligrams a day, 14% of them had quit. And so those were the 3 big arms that really showed a difference. So basically, if you were on varenicline and you couldn't quit, if you went up to 3 milligrams a day, that helped. If you were on nicotine, either going to higher dose nicotine, 2 patches, or to varenicline, that helped you quit as well. So those were the effective quit strategies. They looked at the 6-month data as well, which is what we're interested in, of course, because if you're still smoking again at 6 months, it's less useful. So relatively small numbers in each subgroup, but still important. At 6 months, the people who struggled to quit initially and had the high dose nicotine, 6% of them had quit at 6 months. And of the people who didn't quit with varenicline and got the high dose varenicline, 2% of those people had quit at 6 months. So at 6 months, there was a relatively low quit rate of those people who had initially failed. But if you look at the people who were initially successful, a lot of them were smoking again at 6 months too. So people who initially were successful with nicotine, only 39% were still quit at 6 months. And of varenicline, only 40% were still abstinent at 6 months. So the 6-month data is not as good as the 12-week data, which is pretty typical for smoking cessation studies. So bottom line, we've got this patient who tried to quit with a patch and it didn't work. She wants to know what's next. I could tell her, let's try 2 patches. That might give you the boost that you need to quit. So, John, have you ever put anyone on 2 nicotine patches?
I have in the past. I know we've talked about this kind of dose being high, although I feel like when I was studying for my addiction boards, this was like in the manual about using 2 21 milligram patches for people, I think over a pack or 2 packs a day. And it's a very high dose, but I think it's never utilized. I think people typically stop at the 1.
Yeah. Well, and there's a lot of sort of information, older information, that if you smoke with the patch on, you can like have nicotine overdose and die. Which I think turned out to be false. So, um, yeah. So what I do now is I just try 2 patches, and I would try the 3 milligrams of varenicline. It's not FDA approved; it's off label. But I did look on our ASAM listserv. I put out the question whether anyone had used it, and one of the addiction docs wrote back that she had used it, but she'd had to send the insurance company a copy of this article proving its efficacy. And they looked at the article, and then they approved the 3 milligrams of varenicline a day.
Interesting.
So that was cool.
That's good
Ready for our-
information.
Yeah, so save that article for submitting to insurance. Ready for our next case?
Yeah, case 6, a 24-year-old male with a history of opioid use disorder, methamphetamine use disorder, bipolar disorder, and tobacco use disorder presents to the clinic to establish care following an overdose evaluation in the emergency department. The patient has a history of sustained remission from opioid use disorder until 12 months ago when he relapsed and began using street, quote, heroin. In the ED, the patient's urine drug screening results was positive for opioids and fentanyl. Since the overdose, he has been using street buprenorphine, 24 milligrams, so 3 strips a day, but reports that it is no longer as effective as it once was, and he is still using heroin off the street. The patient is asking whether he should increase his dose, switch to the mono product, or transition to a methadone clinic. What I used to ask myself is, assuming that increasing the buprenorphine dose beyond 24 milligrams is unlikely to be effective, what other options can I offer this patient besides a referral to our local methadone maintenance clinic? I read this article that extended release injection versus sublingual buprenorphine for opioid use disorder with fentanyl use, a post hoc analysis of our randomized controlled trial from JAMA Network Open. So the critical question of this was, how do sublingual buprenorphine, naloxone, and extended release subcutaneous buprenorphine compare in treating opioid use disorder in fentanyl users? The methods: this was a randomized, double-blind, post hoc analysis of a 24-week trial of 428 adults, including 123 fentanyl users. Outcomes were UDS test results, self-reported drug use, withdrawal symptoms, and adverse events. In terms of results, retention, there were similar completion rates between the two groups. So 60.2% in the fentanyl positive group, 56.7% to the fentanyl negative group. Safety, there really was no major differences except for injection site reaction with subcutaneous buprenorphine. In terms of opioid use, so kind of excluding the fentanyl component, subcutaneous buprenorphine showed better outcomes in fentanyl users. So 28.5% had UDS results negative for opioids versus 18.8% in participants using the sublingual component. In terms of fentanyl use specifically, subcutaneous buprenorphine resulted in higher fentanyl negative UDS rates. That was 74.6% versus 61.9%, and that was very statistically significant. So kind of summarizing this all, for kind of patients with opioid use disorder also using kind of a fentanyl component to their opioids, this subcutaneous formulation outperformed the sublingual with regards to UDS results, predominantly for opioids and fentanyl. So kind of like revisiting this patient we just talked about, given the patient's unfavorable response to the 24 milligrams of buprenorphine, I counseled him that, like, I'm always happy to refer him to our local methadone maintenance program. I mean, we do have a pretty good relationship with them. Um, Deep down, I'll be honest, I feel like I've kind of failed a little bit when I'm kind of telling someone to go somewhere else to another clinic. So I think that, like, while I'm happy to do that, if the patient feels that that's what they need, I also would counsel them that, maybe we could consider doing something different. Maybe we could switch off the sublingual and we could initiate a subcutaneous depot to see if this improves your symptoms. Do you feel like you see this a lot?
You know, I won't say a lot because most of my patients are pretty successful with buprenorphine because that's why they keep coming back. Like, I have very few patients who continue to come back if the buprenorphine's kind of not working for them. But my sickest patient, who I worry about a ton and who's had a lot of overdoses, I did tell him, look, we've got to put you on the injection. This sublingual is not working. We got to try something else. And miraculously, this patient has actually done well without an overdose for like the last 3 months on the injectables. So in this, one case of a very sick patient, the injectable was a huge benefit for him.
Yeah, I feel like anecdotally, I'm using the injectable a lot more for salvage. I feel like people that are kind of having breakthrough use and overdose on either the sublingual, and actually, I've had a couple patients do better on this than even in the methadone maintenance program. Now, I mean, I don't know what their dose was when they were still having breakthrough issues, but I find this incredibly effective. And I think I've told before, I'm often quick to admit my wrongs. I was really drinking the haterade on this when it first came out. I thought that the cost of this was just so high that like this was a niche that I didn't really see that we needed. I wasn't sure what the appetite would be for a monthly injection, and I was so wrong, and I want to admit it.
It's good to admit your mistakes. I mean, it's not for everybody. I've had patients try the injection and not like it, go back to the films, but it's just a life-changing product for a lot of people, and I really also like how it gives people flexibility. I mean, that's my one fear about buprenorphine is you're very tied to it, and, as patients struggle with access to the pharmacy or transportation or insurance to pay for doctor visits, like, sometimes they can't get their sublingual, and they go through really severe withdrawal. They get very sick if they can't have that medicine, or you can't go on vacation because you can't get an early refill, so you have to time your vacation so that your refill doesn't fall, when you're away, that kind of stuff, and the injectables just eliminate all that headache. Um, so I found them really, really awesome. All right, another case. So this is a patient, 30-year-old woman, started treatment with buprenorphine to treat opioid use disorder about 5 years ago. She stopped using opioids. She works. She has 2 young children. She owns a nice car, which is a big purchase. And overall, she's very happy with her life. At a routine follow-up visit, she asks if I think she, quote, counts as being in recovery, unquote, because she drinks alcohol now 2 or 3 times a month at social events when she's out with friends. And what I used to say was like, I don't know. I wasn't really sure what to tell people when they asked me what it meant to be in recovery. I'd say something kind of vague like, well, as long as you're doing well. But I wasn't really sure of what to tell people when they asked me directly. I also think defining recovery is relevant because I get asked by my many trainees, like, what's the success of your program? How successful is your program? I don't really have a program, but it's just me. But how successful are you? And I don't even know how to answer that either, since traditionally we would measure success by duration of abstinence. Um, and now, but that doesn't really capture success for a lot of patients. So I read this article called Understanding the Shared Meaning of Recovery from Substance Use Disorders, New Findings from the What is Recovery study. And it was published in the journal called Substance Abuse Research and Treatment. The clinical question is, how is recovery defined by people in recovery themselves? The study design was an anonymous online survey, 35 items, and it reflected 4 domains of recovery. Participants reported on whether or not each element belonged in their recovery definition, and then the study ranked the items according to how often each element was scored. This is a really big survey, almost 10,000 people, and they had to identify as being in recovery. 54% were female, 88% white. Of course, you had to have a computer or be online, and 84% of them were abstaining from alcohol and drugs. 72% attended some kind of recovery or addiction treatment. In terms of the primary substance, 59% were in recovery from alcohol, 10% crack or cocaine, 7% heroin, and 7% methamphetamine. So this was a very alcohol-heavy population. And the outcome was whether each element of recovery belongs in the definition, and people were asked to say definitely belongs, somewhat belongs, maybe belongs for other people, and does not belong at all in the definition of recovery. I want to give a few examples of the 4 domains of recovery that they identified and some examples of the types of items in each domain. So the original questionnaire included 35 items, and for each one, again, you had to say whether it definitely, maybe for other people, and not at all is it belong in the definition of recovery. So the first is abstinence. So for example, no use of alcohol. Second domain is what they called essentials of recovery. So things like being honest with myself, getting along with family and friends better than I did before, handling negative feelings without drinking or drugs like I used to. 3 was enriched recovery. So having tools to try and feel inner peace when I need to, or being the kind of person that people can count on. And finally, spirituality of recovery. So examples are being grateful or being connected to a spiritual being or force that helps me deal with the difficulties in life. So those are just some examples of the 35 items that were in the questionnaire. They then determined which items met, they called it centrality thresholds, meaning it was a central element of recovery. So greater than 80% of people had to put it in their top 10 to make it be central. An item was core if it was central for everybody and all 30 subgroups, because they looked at a bunch of subgroups. And it was called prevalent if it met centrality thresholds overall for more than 26 of the 30 subgroups, so most subgroups. So let's get to the results. The core elements of recovery, meaning that more than 80% of people in all 30 subgroups said it definitely belonged in their definition of recovery. The four core elements are a process of growth or development, being honest with oneself, taking responsibility for the things one can change, and reacting in a more balanced way. The next four are what they call prevalent, meaning it was put in the definition of recovery by about 26 of the 30 subgroups. So being able to enjoy life without substance use, being able to handle negative feelings without substance use, abstinence and or non-problematic substance use, and living a life that contributes to society, family, and your betterment. So these are great elements. You know,
Do you notice that like none of these are things except for like the absence ones that like most treatment programs emphasize from a medical perspective?
right, exactly. And some of these things like honesty aren't mentioned in the institutional definitions of recovery from any of our top organization, even though it's like one of the top elements in these 10,000 people in recovery. You know, some people, most people did say that some abstinence goals should be part of recovery, but abstinent elements were not very highly ranked. And I do want to point out one other thing, which is that these ideas of building honesty, accepting responsibility, and caring for others related to living a life that contributes, these form the core of 12-step that many of our participants have done. It's possible that people are drawn to 12-step because it supports elements of recovery that they desire, or that the 12-step process itself shaped people's definitions of recovery. But this is very much in line with 12-step programs. So how does this compare to our institutional definitions of recovery? American Society of Addiction Medicine has tried to define recovery. They view it also as a process, so an active process of continual growth that addresses the biological, psychological, social, and spiritual disturbances inherent in addiction. So that's kind of wordy, but it's not terrible. So both What is Recovery Study and ASAM view recovery as a process. But these elements of being honest with yourself, taking responsibility, being able to enjoy life, those aren't really mentioned in the ASAM definition. Um, so, it's a little different. The clinical bottom line is that this study determined elements of recovery that are common to most people and groups who have achieved remission from substance use disorder. And these are the elements that we need to foster, support, and use as our desired outcomes when helping people lead an addiction-free life. So now if patients ask me what is recovery, what counts as recovery, I basically say being free of the struggle with drugs and alcohol is an important part of recovery, but it's so much more than that. We work to talk to people about their goals, their non-abstinence related goals, and try to help them achieve those. So, John, did this change your practice or your conception of recovery?
I think it kind of lends support to like how I've been increasingly feeling about this topic over the years. I think like many doctors, like when you start, you follow a lot like urine drug screen results. A lot of our previous outcomes are more, you know, laboratory centric than patient centric. I think this kind of more holistic approach to the idea of recovery is really important. Although I think that some patients were doing harm reduction, so some people aren't looking for this type of definition either. So I think understanding where each person's at, and someone may start with more of a harm reduction approach and eventually get to this is really important. The target shifts, right?
Yeah, totally. And we want people to have, to live their best lives. Um, and we want them to be free of alcohol and drugs because that was causing a big problem for them. And then we want to help them meet other goals. Like I call them non-abstinence goals, buying a car, getting a job, um, purchasing that thing you want for yourself. I never forget a really nice patient I worked with for many years. He came in and he's wearing like a big diamond ring. And I was like, nice. And he said he'd always wanted a diamond ring. And he finally had money after he was off drugs. He was not spending all his money on drugs. He could walk into a real jewelry store, he called it, like at the mall, and bought himself a real diamond ring. And he was so pleased, so proud of himself. So I look for those victories, that give you joy in life, beyond just staying off drugs. Ready for our last case?
Yeah. So case number 8, a 28-year-old male with a history of opioid use disorder and methamphetamine use disorder presents to the clinic with concerns about a potential relapse. The patient was previously treated successfully with depot buprenorphine 100 milligrams monthly for 25 months and chose to discontinue treatment and taper off the medication 18 months ago. Over the past 12 months, he has been using increasing amounts of a gas station compound called kratom to help with mood and energy. Although he's unable to specify a precise quantity, he spends anywhere between $80 to $120 a day on the compound. While he has not used illicit drugs like opioids or methamphetamine, he experiences withdrawal symptoms whenever he tries to stop taking kratom and resumes use. The patient is frustrated, concerned, and seeking guidance on how to stop using this compound. And I'll be honest, this initially started with like a crossover episode for us. I was like, what is kratom? It was kind of my initial thought. And when this patient actually came to me, that's exactly what I thought. It's like, I don't know what to do with this. I'm going to have to do some reading. And then I read this article as a case series called Long-Term Buprenorphine Treatment from Kratom Use Disorder, a case series, and it's from Substance Abuse in 2022. So the clinical question was, can buprenorphine naloxone effectively treat kratom use disorder? And so methods, this was a case series of 28 adults with kratom use disorder treated with buprenorphine. And I'm going to start by saying kratom use disorder isn't a disorder yet in the DSM. So I'm going to say that it's a tentative diagnosis or exploratory diagnosis.
It better be soon because it's not a DSM disorder, but dang, is it a problem?
It's going to be there, right? And I actually love this case series because it was just a bunch of like people that do like what I do, kind of giving their it was almost like I was just sitting around having coffee, talking about what we're doing with this unique situation. So I really like that. So data included kratom use history, buprenorphine dosing, urine drug screen results, and treatment duration. Patients, the average age was 36. Average daily kratom dose was 92 grams. Buprenorphine dose, people were treated with this very successfully. Most stabilized on 12 to 16 milligrams per day. Very similar to my patients I'm treating primarily for opioid use disorder. 71.4% continued treatment with a treatment duration of 5 to 22 months in these case series. So that's a pretty good rate. 82% had negative urine drug screen testing results for mitragine, which is the byproduct compound that we use to test for kratom by 12 weeks. 32% restarted kratom use during treatment, most within 6 weeks. So kind of a relatively high relapse. I mean, it took a lot of inference from this, but certainly a potential treatment option for an emerging disorder that we're seeing more of. I think that the other thing I take into account here is this treatment course pattern, dosage, timing, relapse rate. It seems very similar to our patients primarily treated for opioid use disorder. So kind of phrasing it in that lens really kind of lets me kind of understand the disease and process a little bit better. And I will tell you, I think we've talked about this a couple of times. I've gotten curbside by a lot of people since we did that episode about people, family members, friends, some previously very high functioning that have developed an issue with this product and were surprised that I knew anything about it. So revisiting this case, I would counsel this patient that while, first of all, there's no FDA-approved treatment options for problematic kratom use. There's no formal DSM diagnosis for kratom use disorder. I would personally recognize this as kind of a relapse of opioid use disorder and kind of treat it accordingly, offering them off-label buprenorphine to treat the kratom use component and see if that would help mitigate their signs and symptoms of withdrawal. And certainly the few patients I've had with us to date, it's actually worked very successfully.
Yeah, I've treated a bunch of patients with buprenorphine for kratom use disorder. It's worked really well, but a lot of them aren't comfortable being on buprenorphine. They feel very kind of embarrassed, and they're people who didn't have other substance use disorders, and they kind of feel like they've ended up in this situation that they quote unquote don't belong in or don't want to be in, suddenly having to receive addiction treatment for this product that they purchased over the counter. Um, so it's kind of a sad situation for a lot of people. I just was going to say, I'm glad you're there to help, you know?
Yeah, I mean, we didn't cover this article for our top 8, but we did do the other article where you covered like demographics for this group, and very high rate of opioid use disorder kind of in recovery participants. So I haven't had people with like that didn't have that history to date yet. Not saying I'm not going to encounter that, but certainly there is a lot of overlap in the disorders, is what we're seeing.
Yeah, just a tiny side note. I have one person in my practice who was using kratom in the context and service of an eating disorder, anorexia. And then I had looked into that and came across a few more cases of people suffering from eating disorder and then getting connected to, kratom and becoming addicted to that as a component of the eating disorder because of the stimulant effect. And this patient had no history of any substance use disorder. So
Interesting.
It's very interesting. And that sums up our 8 articles for 2025 that we thought changed our practice the most. Thank you for presenting these, John.
Yeah. Well, thank you for listening to the Addiction Medicine Journal Club. The best part of any journal club is the conversation, and we want to hear what you have to say. To have your opinions about the articles included in a future episode, send us your comments on social media, email, or join our Facebook group. The links are in the show notes. Original theme music was composed and performed by Benjamin Kennedy, audio editing by Michael Bonanno, CAB support from My Cares, produced by Dr. Patrick Beeman and Ars Longa Media. Addiction Medicine Journal Club is intended for educational purposes only and should not be considered medical advice. The views expressed here are our own and do not necessarily reflect those of our employers or the authors of the articles we review. All patient information has been modified to protect their identities. Thank you for being part of the conversation and have a great day.